I know you're wanting to listen to this episode of the Comics Alternative, but before we get started, let me just remind you guys that it's the gift-giving season. Now, that may be obvious, but one of the things that's not so obvious is that you can get all of your stuff and help out the podcast by going to comicsalternative.com/Amazon. Click through on our Amazon banner that you find on that page, and whatever you get during that visit to Amazon, the Comics Alternative will get a few cents kickback. So, whether it be Hanukkah, Christmas, Kwanzaa, or Festivus, get your gifts through our Amazon Associate link. It's a smart way to get your books, and you'll be helping out the podcast. And isn't that what the holiday season is all about? Helping our podcast. This is the Comics Alternative, episode 167. A review of the Best American Comics 2015.
And every day was Christmas Day, all shiny, bright and new. And every morning, Christmas morning, when I'd wake up to you, I'd smile and be your Santa Claus, your Father Christmas too.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the Comics Alternative. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy, and we're two guys with PhDs talking about comics.
And on this week's episode, Andy and I are going to look at the Best American Comics 2015. And there's a lot to talk about with this one. But before we get into that discussion, we want to let all of you guys know that this episode of the Comics Alternative is brought to you by the great folks at Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, for all of your comics pre-ordering needs. There you're going to find all DC, Marvel, Image, and Dark Horse titles at 40% off of the cover price if you pre-order. For all of the other publishers, you'll find that those discounts are 20 to 35% off of the cover price. And every single month, you're going to find some incredible specials. And of course, December is no exception. Sometimes you'll find those specials at 45% off cover price, sometimes at 50% off, but often the discounts can get quite a bit more impressive than that.
That's right, and this month, as in most months, you can find a load of bundles to take advantage of where you can get 50% off multiple comics by the same publisher, which is a deeper discount than you would get if you bought those comics individually. And they have bundles from Marvel, DC, and Valiant, and among the DC bundles is, once again, continuing what they've been doing for the last few months. Get the 11 new Vertigo series for 50% off, so check that out.
That's right, we love our Vertigo comics. So you can find those kind of bundles and other specials by going to the website dcbservice.com. Check them out for all of your comics pre-ordering needs, and after you do get your comics there, please do send them an email and tell them that the two guys with PhDs sent you.
That's right.
And, you know, Andy, with all those comics we're recommending that people read, they're going to need to stay awake to read them. And one of the best ways of staying caffeinated is visiting our other sponsor, and that is Just Coffee Co-op. It's a great place to get coffee, tea, and chocolates this holiday season and otherwise. They were founded in 2001 with a roastery in Madison, Wisconsin. All of their coffee is 100% fair trade, shade-grown, and certified organic. Plus, they roast to order.
That's right, and if you go to their website, you can get free shipping on all orders, and you can also enter the coupon code COMICS to get 10% off your order. So what are you waiting for?
That's right. You got to head on over to Just Coffee Co-op. That's justcoffee.coop. Check them out. It's a great place to get caffeinated.
That's right.
So, Andy, every year since we've been doing the podcast, beginning in 2012, we have taken the penultimate episode of the year to look at what the good folks at Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt consider the best American comics of a particular time period.
That's right. And so this volume of the Best American Comics 2015 covers September 1st, 2013 to August 31st, 2014. So we were well into making the podcast by then, and many things that we covered in the podcast show up in this volume.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I think there's two things that I look for in the Best American Comics volumes now every year. One is a reinforcement of the fact that I have good taste.
Uh-huh.
And the second is to find new things that I hadn't heard of. And I think this volume does both of those things.
Oh, exactly. And in fact, along with one of the things you mentioned, this also tells us something more about what we've discussed in the past, the comics alternative bump.
Yeah, that's right. So if creators out there who are listening right now, just know that there's a strong likelihood by being on this show that you will either get into the Best American Comics volume, get an Eisner nomination, or both.
That's right.
And by the way, speaking of Eisner Awards, we should maybe before we get started congratulate two friends of the show for being named Eisner judges this year. I don't know if you've heard this.
I have not.
Oh, okay.
Fill me in on this
news to you. So two friends of the show, Carol Tilley and Danny Fingeroth, have been named to the panel of judges this year for the Eisner Awards.
Wow, now that's great.
Yeah. It's nice to see those two worthy comics fans and scholars getting recognized.
Yeah, now did you see this on some kind of news site, or was it on one of their Facebook pages, or what?
Both, but definitely it was, Carol had actually posted the day before the announcement was made that big news was coming the next day. And so I was giddy with anticipation to find out what it could be.
Giddy?
Giddy. And then that news got out. So that was great.
Wow. You see, this is just yet another example of me not really keeping up with other people's Facebook pages.
There you go.
And it's something that Amanda has accused me of doing every now and again. She'll mention something that a friend of ours is doing. In fact, she's even mentioned one or two things, Andy, about you, because you guys are Facebook friends. And when she says that, I was like, what? It's like, I didn't know that Andy did that or went there. She said, why don't you read your Facebook feed? It's like, I don't know. I just... and I should, but I don't keep up with it. So maybe I'm kind of selfish when it comes to the social media stuff.
Yeah, well, you do a good job of promoting the podcast on social media.
Well, I mean, that's what I'm saying. I'm kind of selfish, right? Everything for the comics alternative, but I don't give a damn what other people do. Actually, I do. I do care. In fact, all of you guys out there who have communicated with us via social media of some form or another, we do appreciate that.
Yeah.
We're concerned.
Uh-huh.
Yes. Okay, so you want to jump into the nitty-gritty of the Best American Comics 2015?
Yes.
Happy ho ho ho, it's a jolly way to say hello. Have a happy ho ho ho, may Santa be good to you. Make your troubles go go go, it's not really very hard, just sing a happy ho ho ho, that's all you have to do. Share the Christmas spirit and you can't go wrong. Someone said...
there's a lot to discuss here, and where to begin is always tough with something like this. Maybe kind of a broader question is for you, Andy. When you first read this, what was one of your initial impressions on how this is different from the previous year's volumes?
Oh, I don't. I'm not sure if that was an impression I had all that much. Other than the fact that we have Jonathan Lethem as the guest editor, who has done some comics work with the Omega the Unknown series and is a professed comics fan,
right?
And the fact that he gamely tries to make his introduction and his like intersectional commentary in cartoon form. I give him credit for trying that out.
Mm-hmm.
But other than that, he actually he admittedly follows something that Scott McCloud did last year, which is divide the sections up by kind of thematic or topic sections rather than other organizational strategies that editors have used in the past. And then I think for maybe a larger comment, and this isn't running all the way throughout the book, but there are things in here, and this is something Bill Cardelopoulos says in his introduction, that he refers to as kind of paracomics. That is, that they are things that may not have traditionally been thought of as comics, or may have maybe by creators, by artists especially, who aren't normally considered comic artists.
Right, and I think we see this. The best example of this is that chapter 5. Which Lethem calls, "You might even hang them on your wall."
Right. Yeah.
And there's some that would, like for instance, the Ron Reger Jr. Pythagoras. That does strike me as. I mean, it's a little different as his work usually is, but
yes.
But it's still comics.
Mm-hmm.
But when you get to Raymond Pettibon, who also did the cover. It does raise questions of. In fact, there are one, two, three. There are 3 contributions from Pettibon in this chapter 5. One,
mm-hmm.
Well, none of them have titles, but they're given brief titles, text that's embedded in the image in some way. Not really comics, but again, the context of Bill's foreword does
mm-hmm.
tell you, why this might be the case, why this was included.
Yeah, exactly. And personally, I'm in favor of as democratic of a definition of comics as one can arrive at, to include as many things as possible under the umbrella of comics. Like even what's the Prometheus by Anders Nilsson that's in here starting on page 70 is more of a kind of illustrated story.
Right.
But again, I want to be open to the idea of comics as that sort of as a variety of ways in which images appear in sequence or image and text relationships take place.
Yeah. Oh, I agree. I'm glad that there is kind of an opening there of
mm-hmm.
of the definition, or at least playing around.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Because it does, it allows to ask questions, well, what do we consider comics? And, my guess is most people who walk into a Barnes & Noble, and, this book is prominently displayed in bookshops like that, may not know much about comics, and so when they open it, they're going to flip through, and I would guess the vast majority of these comics, if they're not semi-regular comics readers of any sort, are going to strike them as a little odd. And understandably so. So, it does kind of expand our definition or challenges us to kind of flex our understanding of what we mean by comics. And Yeah. Again, I'm all for democratic inclusion, and this is something that we have discussed every year that we have talked about a Great American Comics volume. There's only so much that you can include, and there are a lot of things that can't be included in this volume. I mean, if someone comes to the Best American Comics series thinking that this really is going to be considered, at least by the editors working on this particular volume, the best comics, well, there are going to be some titles and some comics that can't be included, even if they are, let's say, critically and popularly successful that previous year. Getting permission. I mean, this is something that we always mention, that getting permission to reproduce comics from more mainstream publishers may be a little difficult, if not impossible. So that's going to limit things.
Yeah.
So if someone's a big Batman fan and there is, like, hands down one of the best Batman stories that fall within the time frame of a particular volume, probably won't be here. Although it could be listed in the very back,
right.
Which is one of the things I'm glad that the editors of this volume they do every year, is they put in notable comics. And we have one for this year as well. And I want to talk about that section later, not yet. But,
Okay.
but my first impression, because I asked you what yours was, my first impression was somewhat similar to yours. I mean, the big difference is that this is the first time that they've had a non-comics-centric, or at least primarily comics-centric creator of any sort do the editing on this volume, pulling things together. I mean, the closest thing, I guess, would be a Neil Gaiman, who has a foot in both comics and prose narrative. But even then, I mean, hey, he's comics, right?
Right.
And Lethem may have written comics, like Omega the Unknown, but you don't think of him as a comics guy. I don't know if this difference of professional context really comes out in any way. And, I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing. I just say, in looking at this and looking at previous volumes, I don't see a noticeable difference in the kind of selections or whatnot. Although I do enjoy the way that Lethem is a little humble at the very beginning and almost asks the reader to excuse his illustrations.
Yeah. And he's humble, and yet that's a bold move to do that. In a volume like this, to hold it up against some of these, especially to hold your work like that up against some of these creators.
But I liked it. I like that he did it. And and I like the art because it is a very simple, straightforward art that he seems to make fun of. In fact, on let me see, lower or small Roman numeral 14. Or 16, I guess it is. When in his cartooned introduction, Lethem is talking about everyone in this, the people who tend to populate this. He says at one point, I figure I'd be, because he tells us he wanted to be a comics artist at some point, a cartoonist. He said, I figure I'd be one of the great draftsmen like Damier or Gil Kane or Robert Crumb. Then I'd begin drawing drapery and get all confused. And then he says, so I default to these rabbity stand-in. And basically, he's pointing to himself in the way that he's representing himself. And this is the Jonathan Lethem who takes us through these various chapters and introduces the themes or the topics of the groupings that we're about to encounter. And it does look like this kind of strange, somewhat anthropomorphic, abstract creature. I like that, though.
Yes.
Yeah. So again, I mean, I don't notice any discernible difference in the content. I am glad, though, that he retained, as you had mentioned, the kind of structuring, organization that Scott McCloud used last year, and that is to break up the various comics in terms of topics or themes. In fact, I went back through some of the earlier volumes from the very beginning up to 2013, And there are no divisions. I like the way that they're divided. I mean, I like the other volumes as well, but I think that it is useful to group comics in certain ways. Although at times I felt maybe the groupings or some of the comics within the chapters, the grouping was a little forced at times.
Okay.
But for the most part, I mean, everything, they all made sense. I mean, there's some comics that could be included in one chapter or the other easily enough.
Sure. Yeah, so in looking at this this volume, there were things that, that were at the top of my own list that during that, I guess, lists, because this crosses over two different annual lists we would have done. Roz Chast, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant, which I think is a no-brainer for being in here, as is Jules Pfeiffer's Kill My Mother. Farrell Dalrymple's The Wrenchies, Eleanor Davis's work was great during that time. Ed Pisker's Hip Hop Family Tree, Anya Ulenich's Lena Finkel's Magic Barrel was another book I really liked from that time. So, I was glad to see those things show up in here. So those were the moments in this book where I felt like my tastes were reinforced.
Yeah, I agree. And almost all of those examples that you pointed out are books that we have discussed on the show in one form or another, either during a review show or in an interview. So, like, for instance, the Roz Chast, Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? I think Gene and I discussed that on a show that you couldn't be on. But then you and I interviewed Jules Pfeiffer,
right?
Which was, a big highlight in our lives. And so, so most of these that you had mentioned, we have discussed on the show, but there are more as well. Now, well, I was going to point out.
Now with Lena Finkel's Magic Barrel, did you write about that on the blog? Because
I interviewed her.
Oh, you interviewed her. Okay.
Right.
Because I wasn't involved in that, but I did get a review copy of that book.
Yeah, I think it was a timing issue. But I did interview her, which is really interesting. But there are other works in here that we have dealt with on the podcast or blog in one way or another. So, for instance, Fran is included, and I know you tend to think that Jim Woodring is almost always in these kind of volumes, and perhaps so. And I, personally, I think for good reason. But then again, I'm biased toward Woodring. But Fran, I reviewed on the blog back over a year and a half ago, but almost 2 years ago now. Same thing with Peter Bagg, The Woman Rebel. I interviewed Peter Bagg around the time that Woman Rebel came out.
Right.
That's on the blog. And then there are artists here who we may not have discussed their works specifically that are included in here, but we have brought them up on the show. And one that stands out for me, and this is under the Chapter 8 Raging Hormones, Gina Winbrandt's Someone Please Have Sex With Me. Now, I had the opportunity of speaking with Gina at SPX this year, and I think she had just learned, I don't know if she had just learned, but it was the first I'd heard of it, that she had something coming out in this year's Best American Comics, and so she was really excited about that.
That was the one probably, of the works this year that kind of exposed me to something I hadn't seen before. That was the one I liked the most out of that kind of work.
So had you read anything by her before?
No. It was the equivalent of what happened last year with Sam Alden, who I hadn't read before, seeing his piece in last year's volume.
Yeah.
This was the one that kind of, for me, came out of nowhere.
Yeah. if you enjoy this one, then you definitely have to check out another comic of hers, Big Pussy.
Yeah, I remember you talking about that on the SPX show.
Yeah, and that one was nominated for an Ignatz Award.
Right.
Didn't get it, but I think it was definitely deserving of the nomination. It is wild. I love her sense of humor, and I think that it comes out even more so in Big Pussy than it does Someone Please Have Sex with Me.
Yeah.
It's funny because I was thinking in those terms too, which creators or which pieces really stood out to me that I didn't know before, and so that's why they stood out. I didn't include Gina's comic there just because I was already familiar with her work.
Right.
And others would have stood out if I weren't already familiar with their work, like, for instance, Cole Klosser's Little Tommy Lost, which is really good.
Yes.
And that's in the Working the Cute Nerve chapter. I think it was the last two sections, the Chapter 9, The Way We Live Now, and Chapter 10, Brainworms, that as sections really stand out to me. Just because they're different, and also with some of these people, it's the first work that I've seen. Now, I've heard of Matthew Thurber's Infomaniacs, but I'd never read it, and I was really impressed by this excerpt from that book.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating idea. I like that one too. This idea that this character has the power to use, basically kind of like Microsoft Paint.
It looks like it, yeah.
on reality, where she can use use a selection tool to isolate somebody's head and then remove them, or paint over them. I like that. Yeah, that also has one of my favorite moments in this book altogether on page 290, where she the main character here stuffs the guy's face into the cat litter box, says confess or die in cat shit, and he gives her the information, and she says, guess what, I don't have a cat, the turds are all mine. I like that. So anyway, yeah, that was one that I liked.
Yeah, and I think, it's in the chapter, The Way We Live Now, and the way that Lethem contextualizes this is that these comics, the four here, Matthew Thurber's Infomaniacs, Noel Feibert's Cross Delivery, Screw Style, How Did They Get in the Hole, The Pen, and We Can't Sleep, their individual short pieces, Blaise Larmay's Comets, and then A. Deegan's Crime Chime Noir. They all have something to do with the times we currently live in terms of socio-political issues or technology. For instance, you mentioned in Infomaniacs, you have a protagonist who is using a software program like a Microsoft or a Windows Paint as a weapon. She can summon those powers. And then in Blaise Larmay's Comets, we have an interview with two celebrities, and they talk about the phenomena of being a celebrity couple and what that means to them. And so it very much is it's timely, right? In the in the days of Kanye and Kim and Miley Cyrus, they even mention at one point in here. So I really do appreciate those comics.
It's cold and Christmas is coming too. And I don't intend to spend Christmas without you.
The ones, though, well, I guess another one that stands out to me, and again, this is another picture box book. That Infomaniacs was a picture box book.
Yeah.
So, it's last year or so in existence. I think picture box really, went out with a bang. In the Brainworms section, the excerpt from School Spirits by Anya Davidson.
Yeah.
This is another one that I had seen and had wanted to get at some point, but just never did. I really like this excerpt.
Yeah, I did too, and that's one of the longer excerpts in the book. It is 22 pages. But yeah, I felt the same way, and Bill does, lament the passing of Picture Box in his introduction, and points out that he was glad that they could get 2 of their last publications into this book.
Right. And, I really appreciate the way that Davidson goes back and forth between what's going on at the time of the narrative and memory without any transition whatsoever. And so or not even memory, but also fantasy. There are times when the protagonist, primarily going about her day at school, is listening to a teacher talk or talking with classmates, and this will cause her to remember something or to fantasize about something, and then we're immediately transported into that memory or fantasy. And if you're not careful, if you don't know to look for it, then you may wonder what the hell's going on, because she's one place in one panel, and then the next one she's completely in a different land. And I like that. So this has me... In fact, this does what I think volumes like this, the Best American Comics series, should do, especially with excerpts, and that is getting you to want to read more. So now I want to go out and get School Spirits. Yeah,
I agree on that, too.
Yeah. But, the one that comes after that by Kevin Hoyman, those 2... I guess there are 3 short pieces: Net Gain, Swiping at Branches, and then The Perfect Match. They're very short, to the point comics, almost gag-like in terms of their setup and payoff. I love the art, though. And in fact, when I see this first story, Swiping at Branches, and this guy's calling what I assume is his dog. At first, I looked at it and I thought, "Is that his pet sloth?" I'm not suggesting that Hoyman doesn't know how to draw a dog. He draws like a sloth. It doesn't necessarily have to be a dog. I just like the fact that I was confused as to what kind of animal this actually was.
Yeah, well, it is an interesting kind of fantasy world that he creates with his art, and the fact that he goes between the first 2 stories have kind of conventional panel boxes and layouts, and then panel borders and layouts, and The Perfect Match does not use panel borders, but does it in an interesting way. And then the one following that, Eric Nable's Behold the Sexy Man, which is a great title, is a curious silent comic that is kind of more in the abstract vein, and definitely fits in with a type of comic that often shows up in the Best American Comics, which is a more of a kind of avant-garde and often silent comic.
Now, okay, I was going to say something else, but actually what you just said now, I think maybe is it would be interesting to explore. You said the kind of entries that usually appear in Best American Comics volumes. Do you think that there are... It's probably a no-brainer answer, but certain types of comics that seem to occur in every year's volume, and along with that, certain creators that we can almost always count on to be in here.
Well, I mean, sure. You mentioned
Woodring.
Woodring's
Yeah.
Fran and Ron Regis Jr. I remember even that. Let me see if I can find it. Lethem even says in his introduction on page 17, I color myself lucky that by chance my editorial year included no major statements from my personal pantheon like Crumb, Barry, Klaus, etc. So there's those creators, but I think one of the things that I look for too. I mean, I was being kind of facetious at the beginning by saying I look at this to reinforce my my taste, but there's a certain kind of work that is maybe that we might call art comics or something like that, for lack of a better term, that I do look to this volume for, because those are the sorts of things that I don't necessarily get exposed to during my regular reading, even with the stuff we get for the podcast, but that I don't think I would necessarily seek out otherwise anyway, if that makes any sense. So that I kind of get my fill of that of those comics in the Best American Comics volume. Or
right.
get caught up with those, or not caught up, but get new work by those particular creators who I wouldn't otherwise be seeking out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I agree. And one of the things I'd like to do, I just haven't, is to go through. Maybe this is something we can do for next year. We can challenge ourselves a year in the future. To go through all the volumes of Best American Comics and see it, and maybe do a count on the people who appear in the volumes, the most frequent, and maybe look at some other patterns as well. I haven't done that. I mean, if every year when we do this for the podcast, I think at best what I'll do is I'll look at the previous year's volume, maybe the one before that, flipping through. But it would be interesting to do a more careful analysis and list all the creators who were a part of the volumes from the very first, where Picard was the editor, to the most recent.
Yeah.
Because I do think, and this is again something that we've discussed on the show before. I mean, there are, you mentioned art comics. A lot of that is in here, and also, much of this is subjective, and that depends on the person who's overseeing the particular volume. Actually, I guess now it's both Bill and then whoever's seeing the volume. So the comics come through, not entirely, but that two-filter system, because Lethem could have brought his own favorites that maybe Bill wasn't even aware of. I mean, he's open to do that. But they do go through this two-filter, I guess, process of selection. And the kind of creators, for the most part, of the people who are the editors, are fairly consistent. They're not that different one from the other.
Yeah.
So, there is, I guess we could call a Best American Comics style or stamp. And there's not much deviation from volume to volume. But I think it would be interesting to see how many people have been in the various volumes from the beginning. Because there's some people who, we're going to see again and again. And you can almost rest assured that if someone publishes something, that work is going to be in the appropriate volume.
Yeah.
I guess.
Yeah. There's some potentially interesting statistical information to draw from that. While we're looking at this too, one of the other works that really stood out to me was, let's see, It starts on page 75 in the section on storytellers, which is
yes,
Julia Gaffers.
Ferrer. In fact,
Ferrer. Yeah, Ferrer. They did say how to pronounce it, right?
Mm-hmm.
Her Palm Ash, which is a self-published comic that is basically telling a biblical story, and is really, really a well done narrative. I mean, it's good. It's good that it is in the storyteller section, because I think it takes these events and expands on them in really interesting ways. And it's all in green paper.
Right. Now, had you read anything by Ferrer before?
Oh, no.
Okay. See, this is one of the... I agree with you that this is one of the standout comics of this year's volume. It didn't stand out to me as a new discovery, because I knew of some of her work previously, and in fact, her book, Black is the Color, came out about 2 years ago, and I read it then, but it was also a webcomic first, and so earlier this year in a webcomics episode, Andy Wolverton and I discussed that, and that's how I have a better idea of how to pronounce her name than I did originally. On that webcomics episode, we really butchered it, and what Julia did was she tweeted us afterwards to say that we gave it the old college try, and helped us with the pronunciation.
Well, that's good. So thank you for correcting me on that. I was way off, obviously.
But no, that was a standout as well for me. And another standout, and I didn't think about this originally. I guess I should have. This is in that section that we had mentioned earlier. You might even hang them on your wall. Comics that kind of challenge our definitions of comics. This is Matt Brinkman's Cretin Keep on Creepin' Creek. This begins on page 155.
Yep.
And it is a black and white comic, heavy blacks, and it's just creepy as all get out.
Yeah.
But I love the way that Brinkman figures his characters. There's one that looks like a demon lizard figure with a pitchfork. One figure looks like a mussel with a mouth and eyes. And then I guess we could call the antagonist of this story, if you want to look at it that way, is this arm that rises from something inside of a jar. It's strange. It's surreal. There's a story here, though.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that, and I also really enjoy the art. And I had not read or seen anything by Matt Brinkman before this.
No. And that is, that art is really stunning in that what's really amazing to me is how he uses, because it's a very dark book, but uses shadow to create depth. Even though these are completely fantastical creatures, the art style is, on a realistic end of the spectrum, and looks, again, like there's three dimensions to that world, whereas and again, this is not a criticism of other artists, but some of the more again kind of avant-garde artists that we see in here, like the one I'm trying to forgetting what the name of the one that you were like Kevin Hoyman. There isn't that same sense of space or depth in their work. That's not a criticism of it. That's just a different kind of style. But Brinkman's style really does stand out.
Yeah. I was going to say one way of also describing Brinkman's style is Jim Woodring on drugs. But then again, Jim Woodring is Jim Woodring on drugs. I think that this Cretin Keep on Creepin' Creek is like Frank, but a very, very bad trip, because it's really dark.
Yeah.
Literally, but also in terms of its narrative tone. Creepy.
Uh-huh.
And creeping is in the name, so what would you expect?
Yeah.
This volume, and again, this is where some research would come in handy. I'm wondering if this year's volume has more excerpted material than previous volumes. It seemed to me that it did, but then again, I didn't go back to count the past several years. But there did seem to be a lot of excerpted comics here. Did it seem that way to you?
That's interesting. I hadn't thought about it that way. Yeah, you're right. There's, and this may be a general trend, that we've been seeing for years, away from shorter works or single issues into longer works.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know. I mean, I don't know if this is a trend, and I don't even know if there are more excerpts in this volume than the previous years. I feel mixed about excerpts. I think that, if handled well, no problem. And, as I mentioned earlier, if I'm intrigued by it, I'm going to want to go and pick up the book that it comes from.
Right.
Whether it be a graphic novel or a collection of some sort of another anthology. But when it's not done right, in other words, when I read an excerpt and I don't have much of a sense of what the larger work was about, that can become a problem. I think the vast majority of the pieces here that are excerpted, I've read. Many of which we've talked on the show. I mean, we've already mentioned the Roz Chast and the Jules Pfeiffer. You and I also talked about, I'm just looking down the table of contents, you and I did discuss Josh Bayer's Theth, if you remember, during our Retrofit Big Planet show. Mm-hmm. And, we had an interview with Daryl Farrell Dalrymple.
Yeah.
So most, the Gabriel Bell, I have that book.
Yeah.
And Woman Rebel, Joe Sacco's Great War, Fran, all of these, Little Tommy Lost. So I've read most of these, and in most instances, I think that what is excerpted makes sense. Like, for instance, the brief storyline with Little Tommy Lost. Well, I'd read Little Tommy Lost, and this excerpt, it made sense to me. I recognized it as kind of a standalone section of the larger narrative. Same thing to some degree with Anya Ulnick's Lena Finkel's Magic Barrel, the excerpt that we get from that.
Right.
There's some excerpts, though, I would think that if I didn't already know the text, I don't know how I would think about it. And one example of this, and this is no fault of the editors just because of the format, is Joe Sacco's The Great War. Mm-hmm. Because in essence, we have just a few pages of a battle scene, but it tells us nothing about what the Great War was really all about.
Well, I would actually disagree with you on that one, though. That was one I wanted to talk about because that raises different issues. Last year we talked to Bill about what do you do with Chris Ware's building stories,
right?
And so this to me is an issue of format. I mean, what the Great War is meant to be the document of a day, a single day during World War I in a kind of panoramic work, and this is giving us more of a kind of what would be basically the panel breakdowns of that, if there were panel breakdowns and borders in that original work. But I mean, I think you do get a sense of the progression of the events. You do not get a sense, though, of the power of Sacco's work in that giant panoramic fold out of it. But I think I would say that you do get a sense of what the Great War is about from that.
Okay, well, I guess maybe I didn't make myself clear because what you just said, that's where I was going, that you don't get a sense of this larger fold-out panoramic project. Yeah. I mean, you do see, because the actual text, if we can call it that itself, is, this large fold-out. And there's, of course, no way of including that in this book. Even a portion of that, I guess you could include a fold-out, but I don't know if it'd work very well.
Yeah.
But I mean, you get a sense of what's going on with the battle scene, that there is a slow progression of this fighting. I guess what confused me, and what not confused me because I knew it was about, what could confuse other readers who aren't familiar with this, is this actually did appear in a completely different format. And there's no context there at all. And so I think that's where some of Lethem's introduction could have come into play. And along with that, maybe it would be useful, I don't know, for things of this sort to include a page that did show in miniature the larger fold-out. And, I guess you could do something similar with the Anders Nilsson's Prometheus, because that was an accordion fold as well. And so if you don't get a sense of what those are about, I think you miss out on what the original comic was. And so that being the case, it's incumbent upon the editor to set some kind of context, I would think.
Yeah, I guess you're right that in Lethem's little introduction to that section, biopics and historical fictions, which is that introduction is pretty brief. There is no mention of it except that in the little table of contents for that chapter it says 54 accordion bound pages. That still doesn't give you a sense of what it would look like. So maybe having Lethem mention something like that in there, and then I like your idea of having even if it's in really in miniature, a sense of what the kind of breadth and scope of that panorama was like.
Yeah, just a little more editorial context to help guide the reader. And you could do something similar again with that contribution from Anders Nilsson.
Yeah, because I didn't know that about that one.
I had forgotten about it, and then after I read this, I can't remember what I was looking at, but I came across the description of this book, and I vaguely remember us mentioning this when we saw it in previews way back when, and it did mention something about the accordion format. So again, a little bit more information there would be appreciated. Another phenomena that I found was interesting is there were some of these excerpts, I read them, and I was amazed at how much I have forgotten from the original story. Because it had been so long, and I've just stuffed my head with a lot of other things since then.
So what are some examples of that?
Oh, probably the best example of that is the Wrenchies. And I feel really bad about this, and it had me feeling guilty enough to fish out my copy of the Wrenchies and say, okay, I've got to reread this pretty soon, because I can't forget about that.
Yeah. The Wrenchies was a that was an experience to read. I felt like that I needed to have read that kind of all in one sitting to get immersed into the world that Dalrymple created and the kind of logic of it. So when I look back on that section when I was reading this book, kind of reminded me that that's what I should probably go back and reread that whole book someday.
So, I'm glad that we had Farrell on the show, but there's a part of me that wished we had discussed this on a regular review show, because then we probably could have gotten into more of a deeper analysis than we did on the interview. Now, I think the one excerpt that stands out to me as more confusing than the others. And actually, this is a text I'm not familiar with. I'd known of it, but I haven't read it. And this is Esther Pearl Watson's After School. And that's what the excerpt is called. It's from, what's the title of the larger work?
Unlovable, Volume 3.
Right. See, I haven't read this, and I haven't read her other books as well. I don't have that good of a sense coming from this excerpt. I don't know if I wish I had more or I wish I had a different excerpt. I mean, maybe that's the experience I would have reading the book itself. I don't know. I just felt a little lost.
Well, I didn't read Volume 3. I've read Volumes 1 and 2, and I would say that this is the experience of reading the book.
Okay.
So, she operates. It's a smaller trim size for the book. They're really kind of small but really thick books for each of these volumes, but each page is a single panel, except for those times like on page 278 where she does a 2-page spread.
Yeah.
But they're very the idea of a kind of sequential narrative from page to page is not necessarily there. So I if you were confused by that, that may be just what the experience of reading the book would be like on a larger scale.
Okay. And by contrast, though, the previously mentioned Thurber Infomaniacs and Davidson School Spirits, I didn't feel lost there.
No.
Obviously, I didn't know the larger story, but I did feel that with that little bit, I have some sense of what that book is about.
Yeah.
So, you pointed out earlier that Lethem mentions that he's glad that none of his heroes in the pantheon of comics are in this, and those are some pretty big names. And while this volume may not have gigantic names, I mean there's some pretty big deals here, and I think two of the biggest start off this volume, the Chest and Pfeiffer. And the significant thing about that is these are two creators who are known more for strips. Especially single panel, multiple panel as well, than as comics artist. And with both of them, this was either a unique or almost unique outing, because I think this was Roz Chast's first quote-unquote graphic novel. Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant? And although this wasn't Pfeiffer's first long-form comic, it is the first one he's done in years and years and years. Right.
I like what Lethem says in his introduction to that chapter. He mentions, before I learned to read anything else in the Village Voice, I read the Pfeiffer cartoons. Later I added Andrew Sarris. Same with the New Yorker. I read the cartoons and then Pauline Kael. These guys taught me what my parents' world was like. They're both responsible for portions of the brain of the kid who'd later edit this book. So I like that. I like that especially. I feel like that was my experience growing up and reading the New Yorker. At least I didn't read the Village Voice growing up, but reading the New Yorker. And to this day, I probably still. The two thing I've had subscriptions to the New Yorker since I was 16, I think. That to this day the main thing I do is look at the cartoons and read the movie reviews.
Yeah, I'm the same. Although I ended my subscription to the New Yorker years and years ago because I just felt so guilty that those weekly issues kept piling up.
Oh yeah. I threw out a load of the weekly issues. I've had several major purges of those. But now the first thing I do is I go to the back page to the caption contest, and I take a look at the cartoon there, give myself like 10 seconds to come up with a witty caption, and if I can't come up with anything, I move away. I move along. That's how my New Yorker consumption has changed more recently.
Santa Claus, I'm writing you. I hope you make my dreams come true. This year, neath the Christmas tree, leave a go-go girl for me.
Well, Andy, before we get back to a discussion of Great America or Best American Comics 2015, let's remind our listeners that this episode of the Comics Alternative is sponsored by Just Coffee Co-op. Remember, you can get great coffee there. They have a wide variety of flavors. And when you check out, be sure to use our coupon code COMICS for 10% off of your order. Plus, shipping is free.
That's right. And, you know, we both are coffee drinkers. And I always feel like if you're going to drink coffee, you might as well drink responsibly. And this company does give you that feeling of not only are you drinking good coffee, but your contribution to the world is much greater by going to Just Coffee Co-op.
Yeah. And yeah, you know, that's the great thing about Just Coffee Co-op is you can feel good about drinking their coffee. You know, we've mentioned that it is 100% free trade and organically certified. But also this is worker cooperative owned business. So that means the workers are the owners, and they also partner with On the Ground to raise money and awareness for sustainable community development in farming regions around the world. So, as Andy said, drink responsibly. Go to justcoffee.coop.
Yep.
You know, back to the topic of excerpts. One of the works that I was not familiar with, but I enjoyed this excerpt, and this begins on page 52. It's Ben Duncan's Blame Throttle.
Uh-huh.
And this is we haven't talked about this section yet, the second chapter, Superheroes Detoured.
Uh-huh.
And there are other things to talk about in this section as well, but visually, the standout in this chapter, just because of its use of color, is Duncan's excerpt.
Uh-huh.
This is wild. I mean, I love the art, and the colors are very vibrant. So that gets your attention initially. But then once you start looking at this comic, this is another one of those almost drug-induced narratives. It's really wild what's going on. You have a couple of pilots in some kind of aircraft. They're in a helicopter, and they get they fly into what looks like clouds, but it turns out to be something much more nefarious. They get involved with creatures that seem to emanate from the cloud, or maybe the clouds are the creatures themselves. And it just keeps getting weirder with every panel.
Yeah, including an appearance by a couple members of the Fantastic Four, in which the Human Torch had flown into this cloud as well and gotten trapped, and decides that he's quote wasted his fucking life. And then Reed Richards is there, and he blames Johnny clearly for leading him into this trap, and they're all dying.
Yeah, and the thing about this trap, again, it's kind of a cloud-type creature, and one of the things that's going on here is, you know, those scenes that you just described, with Johnny and Reed, they're hallucinations, and this is there's some kind of drug in this cloud/creature that is, while it's eating up these pilots, it's causing them to have these strange, fantastic visions while, and I guess have a sense of euphoria at the same time, as they're being devoured. So after seeing these members of the Fantastic Four, they they see a little kitten at the very center of their vision. And this excerpt ends with both of them thinking, what a cutie pie, as we see that whatever toxins are eating through the helmets and uniforms of these pilots.
Yep.
And it looks like they're being surrounded by intestines, really.
Right.
Yeah. It's just wild.
Yes. And speaking of wild, is someone whose work I always love seeing is Ars Coriac.
Oh yes.
In that same section in the sadistic comics, which is Wonder, very, very appropriately, Wonder Woman appearing in basically excerpts from the Marquis de Sade's Justine.
Yeah, Justine.
And so, because of course that makes perfect sense, and Sikoriak's just brilliant talent at mimicry in using what's his name, Peter's style of the original Wonder Woman comics is great. It works really, really well. Yeah.
This was one of the standouts for me because I'm a big fan of Bob Sikoriak. This is the second week in a row that we have discussed Bob Sikoriak's work.
And you know what?
What?
There will be a third week in a row.
Ooh. Okay, is that a teaser?
Yeah, it's a teaser.
Okay, now you've got my attention now.
Yep.
But I really like this. And the next story, which is Diane Obersauen,
Yeah.
Obumsawan, and I'm butchering the name. I apologize. Not that she's going to be listening. Matilda story. It also has a Wonder Woman appearance in it.
Yep.
An important one.
Yes.
And I was not familiar with this artist before this volume. Were you?
No, and this is Matilda's story, which comes from her Drawn and Quarterly book on loving women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I wasn't familiar with that. But I enjoyed that.
Yeah, and I loved Theth when we got that from Retrofit Comics. Mm-hmm. And that fills out this section.
Yeah. Now, one of the things that I have not done is to go back through to see if there were any comics that came out during the same time period. So from September 1st of 2013 to the end of August of 2014. If there were ones that I particularly loved and think, oh my God, I can't believe that's not in there. I haven't really thought about that. Were there any standouts that are literally out of this collection that you thought of?
No, not at all. I think that once I opened it up and saw that Roz Chast's Can't We Talk About Something More Pleasant, which to me was the best work that came out of that period anyway, is here along, and then Jules Pfeiffer's Kill My Mother, which is not only a standout work but a really important work from that era or that time period as well. So by starting out with those two books, that kind of alleviated any concerns I had that maybe something important might be left out.
Yeah, I agree. So, we had mentioned earlier the notable comics section in the back. What are your thoughts about that?
It's a good supplement to include those things. And much of the stuff there, again, I would agree with, and there are several things in there that if they showed up in the volume, that would have been good. Just kind of scanning it really, really quickly. Sam Alden's Anime, and It Never Happened Again. I like that story a lot, and everything. If I were putting together one of these volumes, it would be basically anytime Jaime Hernandez came out with anything that would make it as well. So he would be the part of my pantheon. So there's a lot of good stuff in here too. That's definitely worth checking out. Maybe Jillian Tamaki and Mariko Tamaki's This One Summer is probably the one out of that section that could have made it into the front of the book.
And when did that? It came out last year.
It must have come out at the tail end of this period.
Okay.
That it is available for.
Now, you did mention the Hernandez brothers, or at least Jaime Hernandez. Both of the brothers are listed in the notable comics sections.
Right.
Gilbert's Maria M. Book 1, which you and I discussed on the show. And we also had Gilbert on for an interview as well. And then under Jaime, his stories, doesn't say which one, From Loving Rockets, New Stories number 6. So there are those. And, others that, I always gravitate toward, people like Dash Shaw and Seth. They're listed in here as well.
Right.
I like this supplemental list, and if anything, I think they could expand it without going overboard, I guess. But this is, one of the things about this last section is this is an opportunity for the editors, both the series editor as well as the individual volume editor, to include material here that logistically and legally they could not include. And if they, sincerely think that, this is some of the best comics of that particular year in question. And so this would be the place to do it, right? Because just by listing it, you don't have to worry about permissions and copyright issues. And one of the things, though, in light of that struck me about this year's notable comics section, unless I'm missing something, the only title and the only creator here that I would call mainstream, and I use that loosely, I'm not talking about DC Marvel mainstream, is Jeff Darrow in Shaolin Cowboy issues 1 through 4.
Sure.
That was a Dark Horse title. Unless I'm missing something, no other mainstream or mainstream-ish publishers are included. I see no Image, I see no Dark Horse, no IDW, definitely no DC and no Marvel. And to me, that's one of the big questions I have, not necessarily just for this volume, but I guess, as we've talked about before in the past, there's really good stuff out there that is solicited every month in previews, and by these bigger publishers, even the bigger small ones, or the smaller big ones. I just wonder how aware the editors are of some of these titles. And I know there's no way whatsoever to read everything, of course, but it struck me as a little unusual that Darrow's Shaolin Cowboy is the only title listed in the back that is arguably mainstream.
Yeah, I mean, Bill addressed this last year when we talked about this on the show, and that they are aware of those things, I'm sure, but they're aware of them to the point that those are the things that already get a lot of attention anyway.
Right, and I understand, and I think one of the benefits of this series, from the beginning, is to introduce a variety of creators and titles that we may not be aware of, right? But this gets back to something that I know I've mentioned before on these kind of shows, and what I see as the unfortunate title of this series. And I know what it does. This is part of Houghton Mifflin's best American fill in the blank series. Right. That have been going on, since the beginning or the first part of the 20th century. This is just one of the more recent incarnations of this. I just think it's unfortunate that it bears the title Best American. I mean, I would much rather have this called something else, because one of the things that a title of a series like this does is before you even pick up the book, before you crack it, it like poses a challenge. Because a reader is going to come to this, especially an uninitiated reader, and think, okay, is this indeed the best American comics of this particular time period? And demonstrate this to me. Whereas if it had another title, or if it were presented within a different context, I think it would have a different feel to it. And different expectations go into this. And I may not be as apt to say, hey, why not mention some of these Dark Horse and Image titles in the notable list? Because, again, to have only Darrow mentioned in the notable comics list, I mean, come on. And that just seemed a little off to me.
You and I have fundamental disagreements about this. And we will probably circle around this topic every time we talk about this volume, every time we talk about the Eisners, or any kind of awards. That I feel, and you may disagree with my assessment of this disagreement. I feel I'm more comfortable with the subjectiveness of these sorts of things, of awards, of best of lists and so on, than you are. Do you think that?
I think to a point, but again, you have to take things within context. And I come back to what I consider unfortunate title of this series. Best of. Well, yeah, I know that these are largely subjective choices, and I have no problems with this. I just find it, in its own way, limiting in ways that we accuse other kinds of packaging as being limited in another direction.
But what it's I get the sense that also with the title of the book, something you said earlier in your discussion of this is what I tend to think of it is that, well, this is part of the series. If it was meant to be titled something else, it could be titled something else. But in the meantime, it is part of the Houghton Mifflin Best American series, and so it's going to have that title. Now, right. Are you saying that by virtue of having that title, it has a certain responsibility to be more inclusive?
I don't know if it has a certain responsibility. I think there are certain expectations that go into this. And this is where I think what I see as the difference between Best American Comic Series and, let's say, the Eisner Awards. You mentioned that earlier. I think that they're quite different in a variety of different ways, or a variety of ways. I think that the choices that go into a collection like this, like the Best American Comics, they're political choices. Maybe not overtly, but they turn out to be, to some degree, political choices, especially given the fact that this is put out by a major trade publisher, and the kind of comics we see in every year's Best American Comics strike me as the kind of comics we see published by trade publishers. And it's a very different kind, and also more small press publishers at the same time. There's just a certain type and a style of comic that seems to be privileged here. And the people who read this are going to go on to make certain choices themselves when it comes to collecting, categorizing, cataloging, and teaching comics. And so that being the case, I mean, that's where I'm coming from in terms of this ultimately having to be some kind of political decision, whether you want it to be or not. It's stacked or packed in a way that, let's say, picking nominees for the Eisners isn't.
Mm-hmm. Well, I get the sense you're kind of imagining a neophyte reader coming into this book and going, okay, this is the best American comics. I'm gonna go seek out these comics, and they're going to not be exposed then to, say, some of the good stuff that Image or Dark Horse or DC or Marvel or Boom or Dynamite put out. But I don't know if that, how much that kind of reader actually exists anyway. And I think the kind of idea that, to me, that those publishers don't need that extra publicity, they're going to get it no matter what. That may be a political attitude to have, or opinion to have, but I think it's a salient one for this sort of thing.
Yeah. Well, no, I agree with you that there are certain creators working in, again, broadly defined mainstream, who don't need, in some sense, more exposure. On the other hand, I think their exposure to certain reading communities are very limited. And to speak of the reading community of one kind of comic in ways that are going to be similar to the reading community of other kinds of comics, I think, is misguided. I see people who are interested in, let's say, DC, Marvel, Image, Dark Horse, definitely picking up Best American Comics. But also there are people who are going to be picking this up that may have little or much less exposure, let's say, to the mainstream. It doesn't give me it. Okay, how do I put this? I have no problem with it, but it nonetheless has me scratching my head. Let's just say it that way, okay? Again, I agree that these are subjective decisions for the large part. I think that, there are a variety of conditions and contexts that go into the decision of what to include and what not to include, as with any anthology. Mm-hmm. But the one part of this that I keep coming back to every year that has me wondering, I wonder why or I wonder why not, is the way that certain kinds of comics, certain publishers just don't get much, if any, attention at all. That strikes me as a little surprising in some ways, not completely.
Okay. And I have no issue with that.
Yeah. Well, like I said, it's a head scratcher more than anything to me. It has me pondering or wondering why. And I know that on the one hand, you shouldn't describe something by trying to explain what it's not. On the other hand, describing and trying to come to grips with what something is not actually gets at the isness of what the thing is. And so that's why, I'm just wonder, at the very end with the notable comics, a simple listing. And if there's nothing from those publishers at all within that time period, okay, then fine. That just strikes me as a little unbelievable, though. And so I just wonder how much exposure there is to some of those mainstream titles, and maybe a lot. If that's the case, then I'm wondering what other things go into the decision-making process.
Okay. I wanted to mention a couple other things in this list, because one of the things you started out with is saying something about this being an opportunity to this notable comics list, this being an opportunity to include things that couldn't be included in the rest of the book. And one of those, I think, notable works that gets mentioned earlier in the book that they couldn't include but wanted to was Steve Ditko's 19 and 20. Or excerpts from that Ditko did not give permission to include anything from those for this book, and Lethem brings that up.
Yeah, that was going to be in the second chapter about the superheroes.
Yeah.
We have no detail as to why it wasn't included. I just got.
Well, I think we know why.
Well, yeah, but there's no detail. But there's the assumption they thought they were going to get it, but they didn't get permission. So.
Yeah, well, Ditko doesn't give permission and for that stuff, and I know that I was reading something the other day about an incident back, I guess, maybe in the 70s or so, where he was given an Inkpot Award, and the publisher of Renegade Press that had published his work that year, Denis Loubert, accepted it on his behalf, and he was not happy about that. He did not want anything to do with the awards. So, because he feels like it puts comic creators into an unnecessary competition with one another. So I would get the sense that opinion is still consistent for him.
Yeah.
One of the other things that I saw in this notable comics list that I felt a little bittersweet about was the inclusion of Dennis Eichhorn's Real Good Stuff 1 and 2, since Dennis Eichhorn passed away recently, and is one of the great autobiographical comics writers of in the medium. And I've been spending a lot of time with his series Real Stuff. So I was happy back in 2013-14 that he was coming back into print, and now unfortunately he's passed away.
Or at least he gets a mention here in this list.
Yes.
Yeah. And there are a lot of names in this list I am just not familiar with, and it just gives me more incentive to seek these guys out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And some of these are webcomics.
Yeah.
Now, last year, McCloud had a section devoted to webcomics. In fact, I have this volume in front of me. There was just one. That was Ali Broch's Depression Part 2. Under his chapter, Oh Crap, Webcomics.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't remember what we said about that last year when we were discussing the Best American Comics 2014. But we probably mentioned something about that being the only webcomic in that section.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there are other comics here that I think have appeared on the web, but they're not contextualized as such.
Okay. Yeah. Well, that is an interesting phenomenon. That list there with the webcomics just reminded me, for example, that I had kind of stopped. I realized I had stopped reading Jason Shiga's Demon and forgot that I had stopped reading it. I need to go back and get caught up on that.
Yeah, I'm behind in that. I kept up with it for the longest time, but there's that. And the thing about it with the whole proliferation of webcomics, it's almost like at this point in Best American Comics volumes, if you mention one or two, it's almost as if you feel like you have to say something about webcomics. I mean, man, maybe they should come out with another volume, maybe not call it the best of, but just something devoted to webcomics that collects them annually in a format similar to this.
Yeah. Or as a kind of web portal for those.
Yeah. Again, just don't call it Best American Webcomics.
Okay.
Yeah. Actually, okay, no, I'm looking at this list. Okay, before you sigh again. You had mentioned that this one summer is not in the list. Actually, it is.
No, I said it's on the list.
Oh, I thought you said it wasn't.
No, of the books that are on that list that I think could have a place in the front of the book.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Okay, I misunderstood you.
Yeah, sorry.
Okay. Yeah, I think that was one of my honorable mentions last year when we did our end of the year best of, our own best of show. Mm-hmm. And ours is not published by Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt, by the way. So
no. So we're free to include anything we want on that list.
So now, as we're wrapping up our conversation here, lest our listeners think that we have problems with this volume, or I guess maybe me in particular has a problem with this volume. As I said at the very top of the show, I really like the Best American Comics 2015. And just because one sees issues or one has certain issues with the text doesn't mean that one is dismissing the text. So, I really did enjoy this. I think that Bill and Jonathan Lethem did an outstanding job in pulling together a lot of different and exciting comics, excerpted and otherwise. And, as I do every year, I look forward to seeing what they're going to do in 2016.
Yeah. Yep, and which they are probably well on their way to putting together.
That's right, because the decisions have about already been made.
Yeah.
I just want your love for Christmas. I can't wait until it's spring. Everything I want for Christmas, you and you alone can bring. I'm very fond of Christmas carols.
We had mentioned our end of the year show. That's what we're going to be doing next week.
Yeah.
So every year, Andy and I use the penultimate show to discuss what the editors of Best American Comic Series consider the best of a particular time period. And then the very last episode of the year, Andy and I are going to give you what we consider our 10 favorites. And as we'll say at the top of the show next week, neither of us know what the other is choosing, although you gave me a little hint a second ago.
Yeah.
But other than that, I think we've been mum on what each of us is going to be considering the best of the past 12 months. And ours really is an end-of-the-year best of show. A lot of people, they have their best of lists early in December, maybe late November. That makes no sense, right? Because there's still things coming out up until the final weeks of December. So we push it back to the very end.
Yep. We have integrity.
That's right. So again, a very good year when it comes to the Houghton, Mifflin, Harcourt's Best American Comics series. And if you want to find great books like this, then you would do well to visit the website of our sponsor, Discount Comic Book Service. Go to their website, dcbservice.com, and there you're going to find a wide variety of comics at unbelievable discounts. So after you do get your books there and you get your coffee at Just Coffee Co-op, get in touch with us and let us know what you're going to be reading. If you go to the website, comicsalternative.com, you'll find that you can leave us a voice message through SpeakPipe. Or you could call us the old-fashioned way. Our phone number is 415-3-COMICS. That's 415-326-6427.
That's right. Or you can get a hold of us by email. We are two guys at comicsalternative.com. Or you can get a hold of us individually. I'm Andy at comicsalternative.com.
And I'm Derek at comicsalternative.com.
And we have our Twitter feed where we announce new content to the podcast as well as updates to the blog. You can check out our Twitter feed at the number 2 guys with PhDs.
That's right. We're also on other social networking platforms such as Facebook, Tumblr, Instagram, Google+, Pinterest, and YouTube. You can subscribe to the podcast through iTunes, you can stream us on Stitcher, and you can find us on TuneIn, but you can find every single one of our episodes as well as our reviews and the comics-related commentary that we post on our blog. And that's at our website, comicsalternative.com.
That's right. All the ways to get a hold of us and let us know how we're doing.
Yep. And we will be back next week with more Best of for you, our wonderful listeners.
Yep. Thanks for listening.
Until then, happy holidays. I'm Derek.
And I'm Andy. See ya.
Ding-a-ling, 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 ding-a-ling. Ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling. I feel so Christmassy. I feel so mistletoe. Just don't know where this'll go. Ding-a-ling, 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 ding-a-ling. Ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling, when I close my eyes and really try, I can almost see the snowflakes fly. Ding-a-ling, 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 ding-a-ling. Oh, I feel so mistletoe. Just don't know where this'll go. Ding-a-ling, 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 ding-a-ling. Ding-a-ling, ding-a-ling, when I close my eyes and really try, I can almost